April the 16th, 1746, a fateful day when the flowers of the Jacobite army lost on Culloden Moor, and carnage started on the battlefield and continued in the days, the weeks and the months that followed. We hope you have all enjoyed our readings on the Jacobite Risings, and if you wish to learn more, then please make a visit to the Culloden Battlefield Visitor Centre, where you can see a large amount of detail on the rising and the battle. We have divided the events into various sections in an attempt to give you an idea what was going on from May to September 1746, in both the government area of operations and the punishments and hardships being experienced by the Scottish people, mainly in the Highlands and Islands. All townspeople and spectators who had turned up at the battlefield to watch the events risked life and limb. As the government troops moved from the field, many were cut down, including even children who had skipped off school to watch the battle. General Hawley was seen riding across the battlefield with his soldiers with orders to kill any man left alive. On the battlefield, Alexander Mackintosh of Essex was one of the lucky few. He was gravely wounded and crawled on his hands and knees along the Cowiniac wall until he was spotted by 2 sentries. From his spawn he took 2 shillings and offered them in exchange for his life. They let him go, saying that they preferred the money rather than his life. For 2 days the dead, the dying and the wounded of the clans lay unattended on Dromossie Moor. Wounded Jacobite officers were also executed in the grounds of Culloden House. Doctors Rattery and Lauder, although neither were involved in the battle, were both arrested and imprisoned, and all Jacobite doctors and surgeons had their instruments taken from them to ensure they could not render any aid to those wounded or dying. Despite repeated requests to be given instruments and medicines to treat them, their requests were all rejected. The booty captured from the Jacobite army included 30 pieces of ordnance with swivel guns, 2,320 firelocks, 190 broadswords, barrels of gunpowder, cannonballs and musket cartridges. 13 clan standards and colours were among items collected from the battlefield. Cumberland gave his men a booty of a shilling for each sword and 2 shillings and 6pence for each musket collected and handed in. Carnage followed after the failed Jacobite charge as the Duke's cavalry chased and harried the fleeing clansmen and pursued them into Inverness. The Argyll militia also took steps to ensure the Jacobites could not escape over the bridge in the centre of Inverness, as they had locked the gates, thus obstructing their line of escape. Cobham's heroes did most of the murdering as they left the field between Dromossie and Inverness. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, government troops were in full control of Inverness. The harassment and punishment of Jacobites was in full flow and would continue for a long time to come. Hawley hanged any deserters he found in jails in Inverness before Cumberland arrived, and deserters after Culloden were subjected to the cat of nine tails. Cumberland, on arriving in Inverness, released all the government prisoners who were in custody of the provost, so they were granted an unexpected amnesty. In Inverness, wounded men were carried out from various houses and cellars on the pretext of receiving medical treatment from surgeons and then shot. There were officers of compassion. For instance, Joseph Waugh of Bathurst and Hugh Fraser's of Blakely's, both lieutenants, were cashiered and imprisoned for allowing 2 women into prisons to treat their wounded husbands. Such individual acts of kindness lay in stark contrast to the institutional acts of violence. When the jails, churches and cellars and lofts could contain no more prisoners, they were transferred to the prison ships, where conditions were even worse than the jails. That first evening in Inverness, there were 222 French and 326 rebel prisoners. The ongoing treatment and the cruelties continued on board the prison ships, with vindictive outrages taken against the prisoners. 400 cattle were taken from the estate of Lady Mackintosh. Lord Lovat's house was also destroyed, but not before anything of value, including 1,000 bottles of wine, a library worth 1,400, and his store of malt were removed. Most of the Jacobite survivors fled south and west. A day later, 2,000 or 3,000 of them all gathered at Ruthven Barracks, some 50 miles south of the battlefield. But by then the prince was on the run. He sent orders for the survivors to disappear into the hills. They must now disperse, and everybody shift themselves the best way he could. Even by the standards of that time, the treatment was grim of the wounded Jacobites after the battle and drew censure. The Duke of Cumberland claimed that the Jacobites had issued an order of no mercy or no quarter to be given, which would be taken as an indication that the government forces should do the same. In support of this, Cumberland circulated a copy of orders signed by Lord George Murray, issued to Jacobite officers. The original of this document is in the Royal Archives. The document shows an insertion into the letter of the words, "to give no quarters to the electors' troops on any account whatsoever." Exactly who made this insertion and when remains a mystery today, but there is still no doubt that the actions of many, if not all, government troops differed from the normal practices at that time. And these differed greatly to the way in which Charles Edward Stuart had treated prisoners after his earlier victories at Prestonpans. It's important to remember that this was a civil war. To Cumberland, the Jacobites were traitors who were trying to overthrow his father and remove his family from the throne. This was personal. It was personal to the men in his command as well, and both officers and enlisted men did things after the aftermath that could be condemned as well as commended. During May to September, 120 of the Jacobite prisoners taken were executed. Amongst them were 38 deserters, 2 spies, 40 clan soldiers, 12 with no stated units, and also 24 officers and men from the Manchester Regiment. Of the 58 successful escapes in the aftermath to the Rising 45 were from jails in Scotland. Only one person managed to escape from a London jail, Alexander MacLachlan, from the Atholl Brigade, who used the lavatory as his escape route. Of the 3,500 prisoners taken, 1,287 were eventually released, including 387 French and Spanish troops. The alternative to execution was transportation, and this was the fate of 936 people. Another 358 were banished, while 92 enlisted in the British Army to escape transportation. Only 88 are recorded as dying in jails. In all, about 80 persons were selected for ballot for the condemned. They suffered death through the executions, which took place with all pomp and ceremony at Kensington Common, Carlisle, Brampton, Penrith and York. Of those that were tried in court, 4 peers, 3 were executed on August the 18th. The highest ranked were Lords Kilmarnock, Lord Lovat the Fox, and Charles Ratcliffe, with the title of Earl of Derwentwater. Lord Ballymeno escaped being executed due to his wife knowing the Duke of Cumberland. However, the fates of 684 are unknown. This could either be from escape or deaths in prison from wounds, fever, starvation, and neglect, or deaths while in transit to a new life In addition, there were hundreds who were murdered within the Highland glens and who perished due to hunger and exposure. The last Jacobite to be executed was Lochiel's brother, Dr. Archibald Cameron. He died without any trial, 7 years after Culloden. Meanwhile, in London, the gears of the government moved. The reprisals against the clans continued for many years. Whilst the clan system had been changing before Culloden, things accelerated fast in the battle's aftermath. The British government were still nervous about French power over the Channel, so any sympathies had to be crushed. A concentrated effort was made to destroy the Highland culture itself. Catholic chapels and Episcopalian meeting houses were destroyed. A strong occupied military force was maintained in the Highlands and throughout Scotland. Legislation was enacted to strike at the root of the authority of the chiefs. The Disarming Act of 1746 made carrying weapons illegal. The Act of Prescription in 1746 criminalised the wearing of the kilts and tartan in public. These powerful symbols of Highland identity were only allowed to be worn by serving soldiers in the British Army. The 1746 Act of Heritable Jurisdictions removed legal powers from the chiefs and forfeited their estates, putting their lands into government hands. Scotland was then divided into 4 military districts: Fort Augustus to Inverness, Spey to Dundee, Perth, Stirling and South. The enacting of the laws was indiscriminate and punished those Highlanders and Scots who had supported the government. This led to some powerful men such as Duncan Forbes of Culloden, one of Scotland's leading advocates, to argue against some of these laws, but with little or no effect. The Duke's opinion was that it was his duty to perpetrate every kind of havoc and outrage, and this was not only permitted but encouraged. From April to July, while Cumberland was in Fort Augustus, officers and men forgot their humanity, and military licence took the place of law, and a fiercely exasperated soldiery became the judge, the jury, and the executioner. The Duke of Cumberland set his headquarters up near Fort William, in the very centre of the insurgents' districts. From here and from the other forts, the government army carried on their bloody suppression of the Highlands. In August, the Duke of Cumberland's salary was increased to £40,000. A reception was held in his honour in St Paul's Cathedral. The famous composer George Frederick Handel wrote the hymn "The Conquering Hero," which was performed with an opera and a stage show about the Culloden victory. A flower was named after him, Sweet William. When the Scots heard of this horticultural compliment, they renamed one of their weeds after him, calling it Stinking Billy. The worst officers of cruelty and punishment of the prisoners were Captain Dunlop, a Scot who was an interrogation officer, Major Lockhart of Chumleys, Captain Caroline Scott of the Guises, John Ferguson of the Royal Navy, and Colonel Leighton of Blakely's for his treatment of Anne Mackay in Inverness. May started with the raiding by government forces known as the Mopping Up of Lochaber and Sheeramore. Invermorrison House was burnt and the Glenmorrison people were persecuted. MacDonald of Barrisdale had his house burned to the ground, and the resident of Donald Cameron of Lochiel was destroyed by Colonel Edward Cornwallis. On the 25th of June, the banners of the Keppochs and the MacDonalds were burned at Glasgow at the Market Cross, and 15 Jacobite banners were also burned in great ceremony in the centre of Edinburgh on the 31st of May. Any colours and standards captured from the Jacobite army resulted in a 16-guinea reward. Francis Townley, who was the commander of the Manchester Regiment, was executed on the 30th of July 1746. In August, all soldiers who fought at Culloden were entitled to 12 shillings and sixpence, plus a Culloden medal, which was struck in gold for the officers, bronze and copper for the soldiers. A legend was inscribed onto the medal. It read, "The deed is done, it is all over." David Morier's iconic painting of Culloden was painted in August, and used clansmen from Southwark Prison and from the prison ships at Tilbury. It was his most successful painting. However, he died a debtor in the Fleet prison. There was Jacobite activity during this period. Ongoing skirmishes and battles existed. You thought it was all over? Well, it was not. On the 2nd of May 1746, there was a sea battle in Loch Nanouv between British naval ships and French privateers, and on the 9th of May, a skirmish at Loch Elliot at Moydart was led by young Ranald MacDonald from MacDonald of Clanranald against the government forces. A skirmish at Arisaig on the 16th of May was the last battle of the Clan MacDonald. The last Jacobite regiments were disbanded at the end of May, but as late as the 23rd of September, the church at Brechin applied for protection from marauding Jacobites who were still active in the Edsel area. During April and May, Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, started his wanderings throughout the Highlands and Islands, still with a price of £30,000 on his head. On the 18th of June, Flora MacDonald met Bonnie Prince Charlie and used women's clothes to help him evade capture, dressed as her maid, Betty Burke. 4 weeks later, on the 12th of July, Flora was arrested for helping the prince. On the 22nd of August came the death of Elizabeth Clunas. She had been betrothed to Alexander MacGillivray, who had fought with distinction, but who fell and died at the Well of the Dead. This well can be easily seen on the battlefield. Finally, on the 20th of September, Charles Edward Stuart left Scotland on the French frigate Le Prince de Conti. 1766 saw the death of James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender, father of Bonnie Prince Charlie. January 1788 brought the death of the Young Pretender, Bonnie Prince Charlie. And in 1807, in July, the death came of Henry Stuart, Cardinal York, younger brother of the Young Pretender, the last Stuart in the male line. The Jacobite campaigns had consisted of 9 battles. The Jacobite army were victorious in only 3, Killiecrankie, Prestonpans and Falkirk. And there was some debate over the first and last of these battles. The British state was successful in the other 6, Dunblane, Cromdale, Preston, Sheriffmuir, Glenshiel and Culloden. What if the Battle of Culloden had not been the final act in the Jacobite uprisings? A recent book suggests that the Young Pretender regarded it as only a setback and went back to France to raise more funding and support. He didn't give up his ambitions until the Elibank plot of 1752 failed. This plan involved to kidnap King George II and restore the Stuarts to the throne. After this failed, Charles slowly disintegrated physically and emotionally. If the Jacobites had regrouped after Culloden, would the French, who had been ready to invade in February 1744 until stopped by the weather, have continued their support? Or would their shortage of money and the fact that the Rising had already achieved one French objective by withdrawing British troops from Flanders have reduced their commitment to the Stuart cause? Crucially, would Jacobites in Scotland and elsewhere again rally to the cause which the government was now better prepared to deal with? The Jacobite cause was of course transmitted and sustained by the aristocracy, who used the masses as footmen who were expendable for the cause. Rebellions, revolutions and risings almost always employ this model to enforce and defend their actions. This is evidenced by the ruthlessness employed by the Duke of Cumberland and his henchmen in suppressing targeted areas of resistance following the battle and in the years that followed. It is obvious that the government were concerned about the possibility of its subjects would again take up arms. Whilst the last Jacobite Rising was in many ways a threat to the government and to the fortunes of the elite and to the welfare of its citizens, but also to the legacy of the Stuarts. On the front lines of this crisis, as well as in the government, there were those who were considered Jacobites. Overall, during the rebellions, some 12,000 to 14,000 marched with rebel regiments, many of which were subsequently broke ranks to return home and attend more pressing responsibilities than fermenting a revolution. Thousands more will have supported the army in any way that they could by using their occupational skills as needed, while others secretly met behind closed doors and talked of better times for their nation, their church, and themselves. Hundreds were killed in battles and suffered through terrible illnesses in prison and were shipped away to faraway colonies where the rigours of servitude fostered an early death. Still more were released after being seized by authorities and were allowed to return homes, to be either required by the government or still smouldering from the torches of government soldiers. Despite the rebellion's enduring association with the Highlands, this army came from all parts of Scotland and beyond, including England, Ireland, France and Spain. And they represented a wide array of backgrounds, distributed across all class divides. Some joined voluntarily, based on the passion that they believed on the feasibility of a separate Scotland outwith of the Union. Sounds familiar. But others went along because they believed in what they had been told. It is in the memory of all these people that we still visit Culloden and reflect on what happened on that field, which was the site of the last battle to be fought on British soil.